Hey, who do I think is a change agent? A guy named Mark Cerny. So Mark Cerny is the lead architect of the video game console for the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation 5. So he worked at Sony for a number of years, but his career goes back many decades. He's well known in the video game industry. He's actually created a number of well-known characters, including Spyro the Dragon, and he's responsible for something called the cerny method, which is actually a iterative design method used throughout the game industry to help create games in a more cost-effective manner and bring them to market, things like that. So he is a prolific engineer and designer and video game executive. So he's really cross-disciplinary and a really intelligent person. He's been working with Sony for a couple of decades now, including games on the original PlayStation, PlayStation 2, 3, and more recently as an executive level and actually leading the architecture of the PlayStation 4, which is a big deal because that is one of the best-selling consoles of all time. And what really makes him a change agent and what's really special, particularly about his work on the PlayStation 4, was his efforts to be a bridge. He really is a linker, which from we see in our videos is bridging the leadership or organization with the client in need of change. Mark Cerny does this in an exemplary way because one of the things that's amazing about him is he's never actually been an employee at Sony. He's always been a consultant, like a special consultant. He has special relationships with some of the executives in Sony, and he's been a consultant. So this also lets him work outside hierarchical lines, which is another thing we learned in our videos. And so when he was developing for the PlayStation 4, he took a lot of risks, and he actually pitched himself to be the architect because the architect of the PlayStation 3 was retiring, and they were looking for someone new. And the Sony executive, who is also his friend, which is also shows to the networking and the relationships that he had built over the years, thought it was a good idea and agreed. And when he took over his PlayStation 4, he did a lot of things that were very differently. In the past, game consoles were typically built in secret, and there was a lot of hush hush, and we wanted advanced technology and new ways of doing things. And the developers really didn't know anything about it until the very end. And what happened is as technology got more complicated, this became very difficult for developers to build for. It was actually one of the problems of the PlayStation 3 and why it somewhat struggled compared to its rivals. So with the PlayStation 4, at day one, even before designing and figuring out what it should be in the technical constraints, he talked to developers. And so by building this bridge, by understanding that they would be impacted by this change, by understanding their needs from the very beginning, bringing those to Sony leadership, bringing those to his team and the PlayStation team, and deciding what they should build and how to go about this from the very beginning, sort of designing with their users from a standpoint, proved really effective. And so they were able to build the technical features that these game developers wanted. The other thing this let them do is it let developers, it was very easy for them to develop for PlayStation 4. So the software and the quality of the games was much better than it was before, and it was much better, much faster. The other thing this let this do is, well, it created better games, which was a better experience for the players. And there's another area where he was a great bridge because he was a game designer himself. He worked with players. He knew what players wanted. He also talked with players and things like that. And so he was able to bring a lot of these bridging, these linking characteristics to Sony leadership that otherwise might have been more disconnected from that. And so you also see that he was inner-directed and yet outward focused. He really was, and still is, focused on how to make the experience better. He'd spent a lot of time improving the controller, for example, and that was sort of a sacred thing and culturally a very difficult thing to do in a Japanese company environment where tradition is held in high regard. But again, this bridging communicative aspect, he talked to players, he heard feedback, and basically the controller wasn't good in certain situations of the previous PlayStation 3 console. So he made radical changes and took risks and experimented, but it wasn't just his own ideas out of the blue. It was really communicating with the players. So he had this communication with the players, the developers, and all these things, and really shows so many of, I mean, I could go on, honestly, so many of the attributes that we talked about in this class. And if you don't know about him, you should read him up, even if you're not into video games. He's a really remarkable person. He's also bilingual, so he speaks fluent Japanese, right? So that's also really important in the cross-cultural understanding, the networking, and the communication and working between these teams. So, yeah, Mark Cerny. Cool.